Start AI companion never. So welcome. You guys are for a treat tonight. I think learning some really new things that will help understand this place we live in and this very long connection of people in this place. My name's Doug McCutcheon. I think I know a good chunk of everybody here. I'm a steward for San Juan County Land Bank. I'm sure you all are aware, but the Land Bank's mission is to protect and steward the island's natural and cultural heritage and provide access to nature close to home. In addition to my work with the Land Bank, I work with the Sound Island Conservation District, with Island Conservation Corps, which is represented pretty well here tonight. With that program, there's a lot of emphasis put on stewarding natural resources and understanding the cultural components to it as well. I'm also fortunate to be on the board of the Northwest Straits Foundation, which is another organization that's working to do good conservation work, particularly with marine and nearshore environments through this kind of the entirety of the Salish Sea. So it really fits in with tonight's theme, I think, pretty well. Last, I should mention, I'm a co-chair of a subcommittee. It's part of a kind of a subgroup of the Stewardship Network because of the San Juan Islands. There's a tribal relations engagement group that sort of formed from that, and then this co-stewardship group kind of stumbled out of that little existence as well. And there's several people here and online who are working on that effort as well. So tonight we have with us Isabelle Maurice-Hammond, from Canada. Does anybody have any appreciation for Canada these days?
Yeah, I put them in the band.
I do have Spanish actually.
Isabelle's a PhD candidate in the ethno-ecological stream of the School of Environmental Studies at the University of Victoria and was awarded a fellowship with the Salish Sea Institute at Western Washington University. She works at the intersection of ethnoecology, ethnobotany, and coastal archaeology, focusing on the deep histories and resurgence of traditional First Nations methods of plant cultivation. Her research focuses on the cultivated estuarine root gardens, which exist at the liminal space between the intertidal and upland ecologies. Working on the island of Tlachels, with the permission and the guidance of the Songhees Nation, she is working to develop a method to better understand the morphological characteristics of these gardens. So I'll hand it off to Isabelle.
Where should I stand for the PowerPoint?
Wherever you like, just out of the line of fire.
Mm-hmm.
Come on, where's my share screen?
I probably go not in front of the window, if it matters.
Okay.
I don't know if that's.
There.
Nice job.
Round of applause for all of us trying to get that started. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This is a little nerve-wracking. I'm not used to like this many people listening to me talk if it's not like a captive audience, like students or a conference. So this is really cool. Thank you. Yeah, like Doug said, my name is Isabelle. I have been doing this PhD for 8 years now, and I'm hopefully gonna finish it soon. I've also worked in consulting archaeology. I am currently working for a not-for-profit that does estuarine restoration in the Coast Salish. So definitely very, very interested in deep time relationships between people and estuaries. And I love that you're knitting. I'm also a person who knits during conferences and anytime I can. So shout out, that's great. Yeah, estuaries. So humans love estuaries. We have globally had and maintained relationships with estuaries in deep time. So this is the Squamish Estuary, which is just north of what is now known as Vancouver. It's Squamish First Nation territories. These relationships that people have with estuaries exist for a reason. So estuaries, the places where freshwater systems meet saltwater systems, so rivers and streams go into oceans or the Salish Sea. Actually, arguably, the entirety of the Salish Sea can be argued to be an estuary because there are so many freshwater systems meeting the saltwater system here. But estuaries are places that are really ecologically diverse. They're places where we find a lot of really culturally important plant species, animal species, fish. It's kind of this incredible concentration of life. So, just that one. So unfortunately, within a settler colonial system and in the last 200 years, we've definitely loved estuaries kind of to death. So it's estimated that on the Northwest coast alone, we've lost about 75% of our estuaries to industry, to dredging, to urbanization, to basically people turning them into fields or areas to graze cattle and livestock. And it makes sense, right? When you think, especially when you go up a bit north on the Northwest coast, you get these landscapes where you have ocean and then mountain, and then maybe this little sliver of land, which is often an estuary. So if you're going to graze, if you're going to do any kind of agriculture, those are the places that settlers would have expropriated and chosen. And then, of course, humans like to live by the water. This is also something that we know here on the coast, how many of us, live to be near the ocean and the sea. So a lot of our major urban centers are located in or near estuaries. So this is the Fraser River estuary, which is the greater Vancouver area. And as you can tell, this was diked and drained for agricultural purposes. There's still a lot of agriculture around there. But there's also an airport. There is a lot of industry all up and down. It's also an area for log sorting. So people float logs downriver, they get sorted there before being shipped off. And this is something that we see replicated time and time again in a lot of our major estuaries. So we've lost about actually it's up to 85% of estuaries in the Coast Salish alone have been irrevocably altered in one way or another. So that's kind of like the big picture, like how our estuaries doing today. But then if we go back a little bit, we can talk about these deep time relationships that people have had and continue to maintain with estuaries here in the Coast Salish, but on the Northwest coast more generally. So one thing that I kind of want to lay out before I get started talking about estuaries more specifically is the concept of cultural landscapes. So I'm an archaeologist. Archaeologists love talking or have tended to talk about archaeological sites. So sites, they're nice, they're bounded, they have boundaries, we can record them as a place here, a place there, kind of floating around in the landscape. But archaeological and cultural landscapes is the idea that these places are all interconnected, that you cannot separate one from the other. So this is an example of kind of a coastal cultural landscape. So at the low tide, and sorry, this is not a great quality image, but at the low tide, you could have your fish traps, so where people would go and harvest different kinds of fish. Tide goes up a little bit, or you got your clam gardens or walled clam beaches where people go and harvest shellfish and care for those landscapes. You go up the tide a little bit, maybe you have your root garden. Maybe you have your berry gardens where people are fertilizing soils and coppicing these berry patches that are cared for intergenerationally. Maybe you go up a little bit and you have your culturally managed red cedar trees or your crabapple grove. So we're really thinking about entire landscapes that people are moving through and shaping and caring for and being shaped by. So yeah, just like a little bit of these examples you might have heard. I mean, if you've listened to Duck Talk, you probably heard of quite a few, but clam gardens, this idea that people are caring for intertidal areas to maximize the availability of different kinds of shellfish. So maybe building a rock wall at the zero tide line, trying to make sure that the beach is nice and level. You don't always have to do that. Around here, there are so many incredible natural long sandy beaches that people could harvest and care for. Other examples are Um, fish traps. So,
Goodness.
no trigger on that one. Yeah, so different kinds of fish traps, stonefish traps, wood fish traps. Here, the reef net fishery has traditionally been a really, really important way of accessing these different fish, or different kinds of modifications to trees. So these are two pictures that I took as part of my field work of North Vancouver Island in Nungi's territory. So bark stripping cedar, both red cedar and yellow cedar. That was really exciting because there's not as many recorded. And then other forms of caretaking like camas prairies, which, you know, we're in a Galeo camas ecosystem here. There's a lot of that, a lot more, or Pacific crabapple groves. So accessing this will be crabapple. And this is also another example of this when I'm talking about a cultural landscape. So this is Hoyat, which is Heiltsuk territories, which is the central coast of British Columbia. Really, really culturally dense and important place. And here you have your stonefish trap. You can see the nice lines for your Estuarine root garden a little bit higher up, and then a shell midden, which might have been a processing area or maybe a house site. Not sure, but very, very dense and interlocking levels of landscape caretaking and use. And this brings me to root gardens, but first, could you pass me our water bottle? This brings me to root gardens. So root gardens in estuaries. Who here has heard about estuary root gardens before? Okay, that's a pretty good amount. Actually, I'm very pleased about that. Has it been like Doug Durr's work? Ish, yeah. Yeah, Doug Durr, great guy. So, estuary root gardens are places in estuaries in these intertidal areas where, for thousands of years, First Nations people up and down the Northwest Coast, and I'm going to use the term First Nations primarily because that is the term that is used mostly in British Columbia. These are landscapes that people have been taking care of for hundreds of thousands of years to be able to access and grow a few specific plant species. So we have Pacific silverweed, which I'm sure many of you have seen before. It's quite common. It's quite hardy. Rice root lily, which is confusingly not the same rice root lily that there's like two plants that are colloquially called rice root lily. One of them is associated with like camas prairies. That's not this one. It's a different one. This one is more like intertidal wetland areas. And springtime clover, Trifolium wormspoldy, that I'm really trying to find here. So if you see it, please let me know. I'd be very excited. And these are plants that have been grown traditionally in these gardens. So a lot of the knowledge that we have about estuarine root gardens comes from elders and knowledge keepers, and primarily the late clan chief Kwasastala, who was a Kwakwaka'wakw clan chief. He was raised traditionally by his grandparents, who were able to remove him and basically save him from residential school, and taught him about all things relating to being a chief, and a lot of that was caretaking of these different landscapes. So that's him at his family's root garden in Kinkaminlet. So he remembered taking care of these gardens as a child. And there's a lot of cultural associations with these places. So I'm not just talking about like a little garden here and there. I'm talking about examples from Salish territory, Nuu-chah-nulth territories on the west coast of Vancouver Island, where a chief was said to have 3 slaves guarding his garden at a time, because you did not go and harvest from someone else's garden without invitation. These were places that were owned. They were cared for intergenerationally. Access was governed, and that meant responsibility was governed. So there were people that were caring for it, that were ensuring that this food was shared, were also ensuring that it was available for the following generations. There's also other examples of piles of roots that were so big that young men had to climb to the top of big houses to pour water to steam them during winter feasts that were dedicated to them. And in Kwakwala, which is the language of the Kwakwaka'wakw, one of the words for chief translates to the long root of the tribe. which was this idea that the really long straight roots were chiefly foods. And if you had like millet barley roots, not great, not good eating, bad luck. It also meant that you just didn't have a really good root garden. So there was like a social aspect tied into that as well. So there's different types of root garden strategies. And sorry, this is one of those where you click and it appears. So like clam gardens, we have this idea of terracing that happens in root gardens. So these plants tend to do really well in quite a narrow ecological margin. But by terracing, by building a rock wall or by having an area that's maybe already like kind of this perfect terraced place, you could increase the amount of plants that would be able to be in one place at a time. Terracing also changed the hydrology. So it made sure that maybe, you know, a place that would have been inundated like twice a day by big tides, maybe it was only inundated like during the king tides now. So it changes the salinity, it changes the hydrology of the place. It also marks the boundaries between plots. So if these plots are owned and cared for generationally, the boundaries need to be marked. So either with rock walls, sometimes cedar walls, so cedar planks put on their side, or posts at the corners as well. And then we have everything else that we associate with caring for a garden. So people would be turning the sediment over, aerating the soil, removing rocks when they encounter them, replanting the rootlets to ensure continuous harvests in the following years, and also fertilizing. So adding fish guts and seaweeds and mixing that in as part of the normal caretaking practice, and weeding. So you'd have like these plots that would be dominated by these foods. And this exists on a spectrum. So again, like with clam gardens, like with everything else, some of these are going to be intensely managed. There's going to be a lot of rock walls. Some of them are going to be kind of naturally already well suited for these plants, so they're not going to need the same level of intensity, but these are all cared for, even if it's on different scales. And this is just an example of what would be eaten. So this is photos from 1999, Dr. Nancy Turner harvesting springbank clover on Clochette. I find these interesting because all of this clover that she's harvesting, and on the right you can see it's just like all clover. It's just this giant patch of clover. I went back to that spot and I like basically spent like, I want to say 2 years of my life just like combing that area. There's no springbank clover left. It's all gone. And I have a suspicion that it is rapidly disappearing from this area in general. It's really hard to find these days. But yeah, it gives you an idea of how, like, this is a plot. So this root garden on Clochette has not been actively managed in, I would say, probably about 200 years. The elders that I know that I work with, whose grandparents live there, don't have any recollection of anybody going and harvesting from this plot. And yet from this unit, this is just one unit, and at the top, that's Pacific silverweed, bottom is springbank clover. That's how much can still be taken out of this unit, even after about 2 centuries without active caretaking. So you're able to kind of generate still a lot of food from these places. Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So are these, the plants in the root garden, are they planted above the high tide line, or they're
Yes.
just salt tolerant?
They are salt tolerant, but they're also planted above the high tide line. So there's like, you know, the low tide line where you'll find your pickleweed and things like that. So they can live with salt, and they need a little bit of salt, but not that much. So they can't be inundated all the time. So this is kind of like where I talk about, I was trying to do this in a way that is streamlined and not too boring. And also I've been thinking about this way too much, and I go into rabbit holes. But kind of the questions that I came into with doing this work, aka my research questions that I'm trying to answer with my dissertation. So one, I was trying to figure out what are the defining characteristics of these gardens, because archaeologists are historically shit with plants in general. So when it comes to like identifying plants, the relationships with people and plants, not great. Estuarine root gardens, if there isn't a rock wall, they don't tend to pick it up. And that's an issue, especially in places where there might not be a rock wall, because people did need a rock wall. So especially when we're considering that estuaries are so heavily impacted, I wanted to figure out whether there are other ways that archaeologists can identify these places. So second question, another reason that I wanted to know what these characteristics are is working with descendant communities who might have knowledge about estuarine root gardens, but might not have the specific locations of them known anymore, but might still be interested in reconnecting with these landscapes and reconnecting with these plant species. And this is also important because in BC, the context that we're in is that most nations are non-treaty, and that means that there are a lot of active land claims right now. And one of the ways that archaeologists can help support active land claims is the more archaeological sites that we find that we're able to put on a map associated with a nation, the stronger their land claim is in court. So there's also that association of trying to support nations doing that work. And I was also interested in how these places might have changed in the last 200 years and how that might make it more difficult to identify them, or how that might make it more difficult or not for nations to renew stewardship. And we don't need to get into that. That was just my method. So that's just like my idea of like, what did people do in the past to steward these landscapes? What might I be able to find because of these kinds of stewardship methods? And then all the methods I tried out, which took a very long time. And then to get into some examples, so I'm going to talk about a couple of sites that I've worked on. So this is Vancouver Island, which is where I live and where I work. And one of the places I worked at is way up the north. So the Nimkish or Guani River, which is Kokakuyok, Namgis First Nation territory. And then the other place is Pachas, which is Mkongan Songhees First Nation territory. So very close to here, and very related to here as well. Oh, and then this is a bit of a close up. So this is the Namgis context. So when I'm thinking, so a lot of what we know about root gardens comes from this part of the world. It comes from Kokakuyok territories, the Chandlis territories. Unsurprisingly, these are places that have big rivers. They have big estuaries. They also don't have camas. So we're looking at a context where people don't have camas, but still need the carbohydrates in their diets. They still need starch. And that's often when we find these giant estuarine root gardens. So people would grow these root foods, they would trade with their neighbors, they would trade with people in the south for camas. So there was kind of this network of trade that existed. So the Guani Namgis site is really, really unique in that there is this deep time recording of it. So Franz Boas, who was an ethnographer, went there in the 1930s. He drew this map. This map does not look at all like the island, and I actually had to convince folks in Namgis that it was the right place, because they were like, I don't think so. And he recorded it, called it a garden, and yet his entire career was like, oh, you know, affluent foragers, hunter-gatherers did not practice any form of like plant stewardship at all on the coast, even though he called these gardens. And then it was revisited in the 80s by archaeologists. He did this kind of like big survey of it, and then it was revisited in 2000 by Douglas Durr for his PhD. So, yeah, which I've read many times. I think which is like every grad student's worst nightmare to have like people like read their dissertation. And now I've had a chance to go back. So yeah, it's a really cool place. And these are all like the different rock walls separating the plots, but also building up the soil.
Excuse me a minute. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
The slides aren't changing for us online.
Well, let's try and restart here.
Are there any questions in the meantime about that? Yeah.
Can you explain what land claims are?
Yeah, I mean, of course. So the fact that nations don't have treaty means that even in the context of a settler colonial government, they don't have any settled like lands. So there are reserves which were allocated, but it means that it's unceded territory. So the territory was never formally ceded from the nations to the federal government. And that kind of creates a really interesting context where nations can go to court and argue that they should have a continued claim over their territory. And some nations have been successful, like Hawaii, the Haida Nation was able to successfully claim the island. So, yeah.
So with that last image, would those sections within the larger garden be plots, owned by families within the nation? Or-
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, every single one of those plots had a name.
Hmm.
And some of the names were like place with really long roots. So, yeah.
How are we doing? Can you guys see the 1930 aerial image online? Amanda?
Yes, now it's clear. Thank you. They hadn't changed since the first one. So this is the second slide we've seen.
Oh my gosh. No way of knowing. Thank you for letting me know, and let us know if something gets funky again.
Okay, thank you.
So this is aerial image from 1930, and it shows the same island, obviously different shape. Not an artist, Francois, but you can see this raised oval right there, which is actually when I was walking around on the island for the first time after we dodged a black bear, it did not want to leave. My friend and I just kind of stumbled upon this like platform with piled rocks, and we're like, what the heck is that? Like, it's obviously like ancestral people built this. And we realized that people actually built this oval by piling rocks to create this area that was above tidal inundation. So you built your house and you didn't have to worry about it getting flooded. And you can see the digging houses on it. So a person I've worked with, Namgis elder, her mother was born in one of those digging houses. So she has that memory and that relationship to that place. And you can see even like a little fragment of a rock wall kind of on the edge there as well. So really cool photo. And this is kind of what it looks like now. So this is a drone photo that we took. You can kind of see us kind of like right there in the little corner. The oval is still there. It's just kind of completely, there's so much vegetation there when there didn't used to be any. There's been a lot of erosion, so a lot of soil has eroded out. This is a really active system. You got the sea right there, and then you got the river. But there's that nice little area that was like this beautiful open prairie, and that's where we decided to do some excavating and kind of checking it out a bit more. And here's the rock wall. So that was very exciting. Probably, yeah, the best day for me that I've ever had doing archaeology. Oh, and that's a little bank clover route to poking through. Yeah, and then going a bit further down, you can see there's like a lot of water infilling in, tides, rain, etc. It rains all the time there. And then also this incredible shaped and carved cedar plank that probably was used as a boundary between a plot at some point. It got buried, so that rock wall was added later on when people were still going and harvesting, and maybe changing the boundaries of plots a little bit. And that plank, we were able, it's 530 years old. So we were able to radio carbon date it. And then as part of this work, doing the archaeology, doing some excavation, taking a lot of soil samples that I did not process myself. I sent to a lab, they did it for me. And then also looking at plant communities. So looking at the plants in the garden, but also in surrounding estuarine meadows that are not known to have been cultivated as root gardens in the past, trying to get some comparison, trying to understand how these places are different and whether we can still see that today in the plant communities.
I
That
want to
was,
interrupt again. I'm sorry, the slides just aren't changing. I'm not sure why. We're still on the historical image from the 1930s.
Oh,
That's strange.
any other questions?
I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Okay.
I apologize.
Well.
It's very strange.
I had a question that the thing you gave at the very beginning
Yeah.
about the percentage of estuaries that were irrevocably modified. Is that in the whole entire Salish Sea or just the Salish Sea in Canada?
All of it, yeah, north and south, yeah.
And it was 85%?
85%, roughly 85%. That's later. I got that from a eelgrass symposium that I was at a few months ago. So that's kind of like recent numbers. Yeah.
I've
Okay.
stopped and restarted. I don't know what else I can do.
Okay, so we can move on to a more Coast Salish example. So going all the way south on the island. So this is, we're getting into territory that's a lot more familiar, so like Coast Salish territory. This is what is known today as the city of Victoria. It's where I live. It's where the university is. It's also Lekwungen Songhees First Nation territory. So the Lekwungen people have really seen their territory shrink or be eaten up by this, significant urban center. It's the capital of British Columbia. It's not a huge city, but it's pretty big, obviously. And then there's the islands of Clutchess. So Clutchess in Lekwungen means the island or one island. So really important, really culturally dense and archaeologically dense place. It is also 2/3 of remaining Lekwungen reserve land. So it's kind of like their biggest land base. And also, at this point, people don't live there anymore because they ran out of water around 50 years ago. So some of the last folks that lived there, including Elder Seth Joan Morris, who we've worked a lot with on this project, she lived there until she was 10, and then their family had to leave because the island ran out of water. We don't know why. I'm thinking it probably has to do with the volume of invasive species and the fact that people weren't allowed to burn anymore. It might have been a tectonic shift, we're not sure, but it happened quite suddenly. But it's a really, really incredible place. So this is just an idea of, we call this Little Clutchess. It's also known as the Chatham and Discovery Islands. And this little green pen right at the top, that is where the root garden is. So this root garden was really interesting because when we showed up, we walked around and we were like, holy shit, this is a root garden. No longer known by descendant communities. And also root gardens and estuaries had never been formally identified in Coast Salish territory before. So there was this belief that even though there's all this knowledge about people here eating these plants, so there's records of people all the way to California harvesting Pacific silverweed and springbank clover, and really having a lot of appreciation for these plants, a root garden site had never formally been identified in these territories. And this gives you an idea of, so it's like really low energy, there's like this nice little lagoon area. Fresh water used to flow a lot more into it, but because the fresh water has been disappearing, now it's more just like a seasonal stream. But it's nice and flat. And this is what the excavation looks like. So we're digging in and it's just this like rich, gorgeous, dark, uncompacted, like perfect garden soil, basically. And I'm gonna go a little bit into results. So the findings. So again, did the same thing, looked at the plants, did all the transects, had my fancy little quadrat that Steve rescued off his boat for me because I keep leaving it everywhere. Spent a lot of time, trying to understand what was going on. I love this photo on the right because after we'd excavated at the root garden, we removed all the roots, we replanted them afterwards. We made sure to put them all back. And because we'd done this removal, it meant that we'd also removed, all the competing forms and all the other plants. And when we came back the next year, the springbank clover was so happy. And it was the first time I'd ever seen it bloom there in about 3 years of visiting that place. And that was this moment of just like, oh yeah, these plants really need people. Like they need this kind of management. And that was kind of replicated. So, did all these plots, recorded all these plant species, looked at indicator species, so which species are most strongly associated with different places. And at the root garden site, compared to the other places we checked around in Clutchess, springbank clover and Pacific silverweed, both indicator species. So really strongly associated with these places of past cultivation and stewardship. So going up north to the Nimkish River, which is this really well-known recorded root garden, I was like, oh yeah, like got this in the bag. It's absolutely definitely going to be the same thing. And it absolutely was not. In fact, the plant species, so Pacific silverweed, springbank clover, rice root lily, was more strongly associated with the places that were not known to have been cultivated in the past. But the garden site was more strongly associated with kind of like later successional species. And I think what happened there is because people had been building soil and caring for soil over generations, this lack of active harvesting and caretaking for about 200 years kind of created a condition where ecological shifts started to happen. So you're seeing more shrubs, you're seeing more grasses, versus these unmanaged areas are still kind of in the state where they get inundated, things are moving around a lot. It's creating a condition where these plants can remain. But what is true for both places is the importance of soil. So even if you're still getting the plants at the Nymphis River, you don't want to necessarily be eating and harvesting them because the soil is only about this deep. And then you're hitting sand, like packed sand and rock. So you're not getting the good roots. You want that really deep soil. And in both cases, that's what you find is the really deep soil. It's loose, it's uncompacted, it's really rich in organics. It's perfect. People were removing rocks. You were really, they're always like about like this deep. So really, really good soils, which is rare in these settings.
Sorry, what is that deep?
The soil.
Like the A horizon?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
And this is just one of the tests. So there were other elements that popped up, but it's the soil phosphorus I like to talk about because it really pops up. So available soil phosphorus is something that's been used by archaeologists in different contexts to indicate areas of human use and occupation. Humans create phosphorus through garbage, through refuse, through our presence. You can also create high levels of soil available phosphorus through fertilization. So by adding fertilizer into the soil. And in each case, so at the chest on the right, that is the available soil phosphorus in the root garden compared to the other places. The second highest is actually the place where there used to be clover all the way until the 1990s. So that was interesting. And then same as the Nymphis River in Nunki's territory, the available soil phosphorus in the root garden is significantly higher. So not only is the sediment visibly different, but it is chemically distinct as well. So when I came out of there, I was like, okay, what are the lessons? What is my final paper that I'm still writing for my dissertation, which I'm hoping to defend by the end of the summer, which is seeming increasingly unlikely. And the lesson is that there is no one size fits all. That would be great. I wish there was, but there isn't, because what happens to these places, how they change over time, is shaped by the cultural context that they're in, by the ecological context that they're in, by the hydrology, by the climate, by all these different factors. So plant communities might not necessarily be the indicator for these places having been cultivated in the past. However, there are lasting markers, and the soil is really the place to look. So I think it's really looking at the sediment of these places. And these are still alive. So these are still producing root foods, often in massive quantities, 100, 200 years post-stewardship. So there is, they are places that are not just about the past, but they're also about the future. And this is how I'm kind of closing it off. So I'm an archaeologist. I came into this work very much with this archaeological mindset. And increasingly, I'm working in ecological restoration and thinking about these relationships through the lens of ecocultural restoration. And thinking about the restoration of estuaries specifically. So learning about estuaries in the past, I think, can really help inform restoration and really help inform how they are stewarded into the future. And what I found kind of working in restoration spaces is that there is a need for that collaboration to happen. There needs to be a centering of relationships. There needs to be a centering of the relationships between the indigenous people and landscapes. And also our archaeologists and ecologists and all these different, people that tend to live in their little siloed world need to work together on this. And like one thing I found with estuaries, and one thing I'm trying to like help push forward these days, is when you think of estuary restoration, a lot of the money is on restoring estuaries for salmon, and that's really important. Everybody wants the salmon to do well. Everybody wants the salmon to come back. However, there's no real thought paid to what's happening a little bit higher up in the estuary. So thinking about what relationships would people want to renew with these places? Do people want to be harvesting certain kinds of fruit foods again? Do people want to be harvesting certain kinds of medicines there again? How can all that be tied into how we understand restoration in these places? And this is happening. This is happening in different areas and in different ways. So restoration of clam gardens, I'm sure many of you know about this and have heard about this. In Swinomish, there was a really big one in 2023. It's also happening a lot where I live. So Melhat First Nation territory, that's part of this ongoing care for clam gardens. Pawcashin First Nation is doing a big clam garden build in August, which is really exciting. And it's also happening in the context of estuaries. So Cowichan First Nation, which is on Vancouver Island, has been working for a few years now in restoring their estuary, which was heavily altered. And this is a really community-centered project. So the community is the one that is at the nursery choosing the plants that go back into the estuary, replanting, and they've really been central in kind of the restoration of this place. There's also examples from Tsleil-Waututh territory near Vancouver where the nation has built 3 entire new estuarine root gardens. So I think the great joy of this work for me is seeing that thread, and seeing how doing archaeology on the coast is really exciting because you get to work with community and you get to, see these places come alive again. And that's been, a huge privilege. So that's me. Thank you so much for your time and your attention. Really appreciate it. I have no idea how long that was. I think I kind of blacked out. Okay. Are there questions?
How do these root gardens interact with the estuaries themselves?
So they're at kind of like a higher estuarine meadow area. So, when you go into an estuary, you get kind of like your pickleweed, and then you get your arrowgrass. Sorry, I'm trying to explain this in a way that isn't too plant specific. By interact, what do you mean?
Like what happens up here that kind of ends up going down into the estuary, if that makes sense?
No, I still don't understand your question.
I'll think about it.
Okay. Come back to me.
Like with the fertilizer that they're putting on, maybe have flow-on effects to say a clam garden that's slowed down.
I mean, that could be the case. Probably not though, just because often these are perched enough communities that again, they will be fully tidally inundated, maybe like during like storm surge events or king tide events. So we're not really seeing that same kind of like back and forth flow. These aren't places that tend to be like inundated twice a day. Was that your question?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah.
What were the primary inputs and cultivation techniques used to maintain these, and how intensive was that?
Yeah, I mean, again, really varied. So intensity is always on a scale, but people would use digging sticks as a way to turn over soil. And these digging sticks were often made out of yew trees, which tended to be associated with village sites generally. So old yew trees have that strong association. So people would use that to turn the sediment over, turn the soil over. That would be a chance to remove rocks. That would also be a chance to mix things. So Cox's fella had this saying that good root garden soil had a little bit of everything. So you wanted to have that organic matter, you wanted sand, you wanted a little bit of clay, so kind of just having a nice mixing, which is why, actually I don't have the data to say that, but tended to have that mixing, removing of rocks. So these sediments tend to not have any big rocks in them, and then adding in the fertilizer as well. Okay. The back first,
Okay. Do you find that these root gardens have any sorts of like soil stabilization and, as we see coastal erosion everywhere, how that might be related to the lack of or continued preservation of the garden?
Yeah, I think one thing that's good is that they tend to be perched a little bit higher up in the estuary. So I think that means that in some cases, there has been more preservation of them. I do think that rising sea levels and increased storminess is going to be causing a shift in those places. We're already seeing like more salinity coming into these systems, which is changing them. And then there's also a lot of estuaries that have been changed either partially or like quite a lot by things like, you know, like even up north where you're like, oh, like those estuaries, nothing's really happened, but often they were used for log dragging. So bringing logs from a river system to the ocean, you would drag them through estuaries. So that's hard to say, but I do think that in the next 50 years, we're gonna see a lot of changes, unfortunately, which means that this work, yeah.
A lot of your examples seem to be in the Salish Sea. Do you know like how widespread outside of the Salish Sea? Is it estuarine guarded sorts?
Yeah, I mean, again, like a lot of it is
Could you repeat that, please?
how widespread.
Outside of the Salish.
Yeah, outside of the Salish Sea. Yeah, so there are examples of the Salish Sea. A lot of it is kind of central Vancouver Island going north. So there's a lot of examples on either side of Vancouver Island. So like Nochelmouth and Kwakwatuk territories, and then going up the central coast as well. So Heiltsuk territories, all the way kind of into southern Alaska. I don't know about the rest of Alaska. I don't know that a lot of work has been done to look for these places there yet. Yeah, but that's kind of the extent of it so far. Yeah. So, Steve?
Yeah, I talked to you a little bit about this, and I find it fascinating that this much work was done to maintain and build soil to that depth to build those kind of roots. So were there importance to these three species of plants besides just the carbs, or is it a trait value or something really high? Or why, you know, I don't quite see in this rich world of foodstuffs spending that much time on these kind of things unless it has some other, I guess carbs are great, you know.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, who doesn't love? I have a separate lecture on potatoes I can give. But I think importance in this case is often so deeply intertwined. So you can't really separate economic importance from cultural importance from nutritional importance, you know, because we have these root foods. We know they were really important in diets because you do need carbs, you need starch in your diet, especially if there's a lot of fishing going on, if there's a lot of hunting, you do need to be balancing it out. And you could preserve these through the winter as well. So you'd have access to that through the winter. You harvest them in the fall and then you have access to them through the winter. They were traded in really large quantities, but they were also known to be really spiritually important. So there were feasts dedicated to their consumption and to sharing them. They had like strong spiritual associations as well, with transformer stories even. So it's all kind of tied in to this system. Yeah.
Well, maybe I missed it, but how were these roots cooked and eaten? And
Yeah.
have you tried them yourself, and what do they taste like?
I have. So they could be steam cooked. So here on the coast, pit cooking is kind of the traditional way of cooking camas and other kinds of foods. So they could be steam cooked. They could be eaten fresh, especially springbank clover, which is my favorite. It kind of tastes like mung bean sprouts when you eat it fresh. So one of the reasons that people would also harvest every year is you don't want the roots to get old, because if they get old, they get kind of tough and woody, silverweed especially, so it's not as good. And people would also boil them. So bedwood boxes were used to boil them. You could also preserve them in soil. So there's stories of people that had these like bedwood boxes full of marsh soil, and then they would just keep the roots in them over the winter, so you'd have fresh access as well. Yeah.
Okay, so something I was curious about is like how the management of estuarine gardens and other like maybe like other indigenous management practices influence freshwater systems, as well as maybe like more like the brackish water systems in the estuary. Because you mentioned earlier, like fire and like other management practices, like the lack of those indigenous practices. perhaps being a reason that there was the complete like loss of water, saying that you weren't totally sure. Cause I'm living on this island right now and I have a very vested interest in there being water here.
Yes,
Um,
yeah.
So that's just something, I don't know if you talk more about like indigenous management practices and kind of like influences on freshwater systems as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I don't know as much about that. I do know that the loss of fire as a management strategy has resulted in these environments where, you know, this used to be a prairie, but now it's full of Douglas firs. And that's great. We love Douglas firs, but, you know, these larger plants take up more water that would otherwise be in the ground and therefore accessible to other species. And that's not even accounting for invasive species. So, you know, like on that island on Clochas, I have walked around that island so many times. I've never walked across it because you can't, because it's all blackberry and you'll be torn to shreds. So blackberry, virgin laurel, not as much there, but still, and then Scotch broom, really, really bad. So yeah, I know that. And then in terms of freshwater systems, I'm not quite sure, but I do know that like all the practices often tied to agriculture of draining and restructuring where the water flows, that all has impacts on what is available in the ground.
Like freshwater systems
Yeah.
coming in, like limited freshwater coming into the estuary,
Yeah.
affecting salinity and all that.
Yes, yeah. So that changes. So it's like, you know, I've been here on this island for a few days walking around being like, hey, where's the root garden? And that's hard because so many of these freshwater systems have been changed. And so like places that you're like, oh, there was probably a stream here in the past and therefore it would have been perfect conditions, but it's gone now. And so it's kind of hard to kind of reconstruct that. Yes.
So are there any sites in the San Juan specifically? I don't know how long you've been looking around here, or even just like looking at maps, having done this for a while, you're like, that spot, like, we should go there.
There's areas that are promising. I don't want to say too much. I'm gonna do a bit more work and try and figure it out. There's a couple places that are very, very interesting. I'm interested in, because there's a place in Lekwungen territories and Songhees territory, and because the border is not real, and you know, even though it took me 10 hours and 2 ferries and an international border to get here, and it'd be like 20 minutes by boat, I could like basically see my house from San Juan. So like people were going back and forth, and my way of thinking is if there was the knowledge of estuarine root gardening stewardship in Lekwungen territories, of course that would be shared. Like, of course there would be this relationship across the border. So, yeah.
I want to share just a quick little story that's halfway related to that. So Clover Point is at the southernmost tip right by Victoria, and that is actually named for springbank clover. And that was like hyper abundant there. That's how it drew its name. Today, you'd be hard pressed to find some at that location. It was where the sewage outfall from Victoria was, if you've ever visited there. That
was our entire coastline, to be fair, until like a few years ago.
The family group that was associated with that site, their reef net site, was on the south end of San Juan Island. And last year, in the following decades, literally of intensive plant surveys, Peter Dunwee and his gang of botanists did find like 6 plants of this clover, and it's right in the location of where the family group that had the reef net site that was also associated with Clover Point. Was it the exact same clover? You know, who knows? But you know, there's coincidences and there's also not coincidences. There's some geography that's very similar between those areas, but just very interesting that that clover does seem to be otherwise extirpated from the islands. I know I've gone on and on this with many people, but Gavin Menzies in the 1790s, like the first description we get of that chocolate lily in North America, was in the San Juan Islands. It was probably over somewhere near Orcas or Cyprus. And so it's another plant that is now a state listed plant and is known from the San Juan Islands. But somebody who was here for 2 days in 1790, you know, he collected it. So there's some things you can draw from that in terms of likelihood of these plants having been tended in here and those relationships changing, the damage to these estuaries. That are stories we can learn from. And when we're thinking about restoration, maybe thinking about some of these plants, some of these relationships with people as part of that big picture.
Yeah, and we also know that people, you know, like maybe somebody would move for marriage or to visit relations, would bring plants with them. And we have these like really interesting nested communities. Like we'll find like camas patches. There's camas patches in Bamfield, which is like north of Tofino on the west coast of Vancouver Island. It shouldn't be there, but it's there because people brought it there because they had a relationship with camas and they wanted it to be near where they lived. So we know that that happened. Yes, in the back.
I thought you mentioned potatoes, so I.
Yes.
Post-contact, cultural adaptation of going from camas to potatoes. And was there a similar cultural adaptation in terms of the actual estuarial crops and things like that?
That's a bit of a harder one. A lot of the estuaries were stolen from Indigenous people because, again, those were the only flat places where people, settlers, could bring in cattle, could ranch, could farm. So a lot of the time, you know, there are all these historical documents of people from different nations going and trying to argue the case to maintain access and be like, listen, this is a root garden. We've been here for hundreds of years. Like, this is where it is. And, you know, the colonial record keepers being like, oh, well, this is a proposed agricultural site. Like they only recognized cultivars that were known to Europeans already. That being said, people adapted really quickly. Like, you know, people on the Northwest Coast started harvesting and developing their own varieties of potatoes in the 1700s because they knew how to care for root foods already. Like they had that knowledge. So yeah, those are cool. Yeah.
You mentioned that like among some of those root plants they grew for sustenance, there are some for medicinal purposes. What are some of those examples? I'm just a little bit curious.
That I'm not as familiar with. And it's also not something I necessarily feel comfortable sharing because medicinal plants are often tied to family knowledge. So what's been shared with me is not necessarily something that I am comfortable sharing out. However, there's a lot of resources out there if you are interested. There's some really great guidebooks that talk about medicinal plants and where to find them on the coast. But there are a lot that are associated with estuaries as well. So when people are talking about estuarine restoration, renewing those relationships, they're talking about foods, but they're also talking about accessing medicines. Yeah, in the back.
During your research, have you found any evidence of burning estuaries?
So that's a really interesting question. We were just talking about that yesterday. So Maurice Major, who works for state parks, he was talking to me about that, and he had found accounts of folks kind of in the Salish Sea, but you know, more Olympia area, and they would talk about marsh prairies. And they would talk about the burning of marsh prairies. And I have found higher elevations of carbon in the sediments of the garden sites. That's hard to, like, association is hard to tell, right? Because it could also be that people had their, like, you know, fires because they were staying there for a while, cooking foods or whatever. And some of those I think would be difficult to burn. But I have wondered about it. I don't know, but I think it's possible. Yeah. Yeah,
I'm very curious about berry gardens, and I know it's not your specialty, but looking at that first picture, I mean, sites are all related and contiguous. Is there any good, like when you're poking around, like what's the signal for berries?
I mean, like okay, so it's kind of like the strongest one that I've ever encountered personally was when I was doing archaeology for Namgis. So I was doing forestry service. So I would just get dropped down at the end of a logging road and they would be like, pick you up in 8 hours. And I'd be like, sick, great, I love that. And just go wander the forest. And this was way down this bumpy logging road at the top of a mountain. So old growth yellow cedar, which is hard to find. First of all, it's hard to find old growth, and then it's hard to find old growth yellow cedar. And we're walking around this forest and we're just like chest deep in berries. So mostly blue huckleberry. And then we started looking around at these cedars and every single cedar has a bark strip. And we realized it's because people, primarily women, were hiking up this mountain because they didn't have the logging roads, so they were hiking up along trails, and then they were harvesting berries there, and they were building baskets while they were there. So in that case, we had that association because of all those bark strip cedars. Other associations are, you know, like folks often will remember the location of specific berry patches. So that's often knowledge that is kept within community and is really prized information and treasured. Yeah. Yeah.
So earlier you were talking about the idea that they've been hard to identify before because people have been looking for obvious signs of landscape modification, like a rock wall. But most of the examples you have shown have also had obvious examples of landscape modification, like the house structures or again, rock wall structures. And I guess I wonder the difficulty of or interest in proving, quote unquote, that an area is a site, quote unquote, without these very obvious features. Or you had mentioned that soil depth is it statistically correlated with
I don't know
these places?
statistically. I don't think my sample size is big enough to really answer that question, to be honest. I think it's notable, but I hear you. But actually the Rugard Eclogese doesn't have a rock wall. What it does have is that there's this like peat-like sediment. It's not quite peat, but it's like really waterlogged sediment. And that's really common on that island and a lot of the little tidal inlets. But at this garden site, it's only about this wide the whole way. And my thinking there is that people didn't need to build a rock wall because that was already serving as an erosional barrier. And maybe even they were maintaining it at that width, which would involve a lot of labor to kind of like make sure that the sediment was turned around enough to kind of like make sure it didn't become that way. So yeah, that's something I'm thinking a lot about for this paper I'm writing of. I don't think there is a single smoking gun, but I do think that there are a series of tools that can be utilized to help in identifying these places. I think looking at plant communities is so important. And I think looking at sediment structure and maybe running those soil tests is also important. And I'm hoping to get a bigger sample size if somebody will take me on as a postdoc and give me money for it. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, with that, I think we might kind of close this out. How many people are going to talk to somebody about estuarine gardens tomorrow? Yeah, pretty
Me
cool.
also for the rest of my life, probably.
Yeah.
Thank you for indulging me.
So yeah, thank you very much, and thank you.
Yeah, I'm on island for the next few days, living in my van in Doug and Carrie's yard. So I don't know, good shout.